I woke sweating with my phone in my hand and that damned picture of my brother staring back at me, hollow cheeks and collarbones like coat hangers. The caption screaming 95 pounds like a verdict. I'm a man, only man telling this, and that image shoved me back into the neat little rituals that ruled my childhood like laws. I remembered a birthday when I was 5, my mother slicing cake and handing Ryan a big piece while she carefully plated me 2 tiny forkfuls like she was rationing joy. She ran the scale every morning before breakfast, made us step on it like confession. If I'd gained even a pound, she swapped my oatmeal for black tea and said, "Nobody wants a chubby girl," pinching my stomach and smiling like it was affection. I learned early that affection could come wrapped in punishment. By 7, I knew calories the way other kids knew the alphabet. By 9, I was hiding in bathrooms after meals to cry because my stomach hurt from either hunger or shame, sometimes both. At 12, she threw a box of sanitary pads at me like it was a crime scene. Her voice said I was ruining everything by growing up. At 13, I overheard her on the phone with her friend Amber. "I love her because I have to, but I don't like her. She's not what I pictured." That line landed in me like a brick. I stopped eating for weeks. Iced diet soda and the cold light of my bedroom were the only things that kept me steady. When I finally collapsed in gym class and they called my parents, she didn't panic, she was furious at being seen. "If you wanted attention, you could have just asked," she hissed in the car. My father tried to help in the small ways he could, sneaking me extra food, but his words were always 2 steps from her. "Just try to make her happy." That made him complicit in a softer way that hurt worse, because he could have stopped it and didn't. Ryan watched a lot of it like an audience member, smirking sometimes, silent other times. The first real fight came when I was 17. I told her I wasn't going to be Chloe, the neighbor's daughter she kept holding up as a model. "I'm not Chloe," I said flatly at dinner, and she slapped me in front of everyone. Dad didn't move. Ryan smirked like it was a show. That night I packed 2 duffel bags, forged a signature on my college apps because she refused to support me, and took a scholarship to Northern Hills State. I left a note on the kitchen table that said simply, "I choose myself." Walking out felt like ripping a bandage off rotten skin. It hurt, but it freed me. Leaving didn't erase the damage. Years later, I still measured myself in tiny, private ways, extra weigh-ins, secret scales, compliments that sounded like traps. I built a little life away from that house. I worked nights at a bookstore, paid my own bills, saw a therapist in secret, and learned to name my mother's voice when it crawled into my head. I learned how to breathe when the voice told me to shrink. I learned boundaries by testing them like steps on a shaky bridge. That's the thing, survival becomes muscle memory. I learned to feed myself on my own terms, but the shadow of her judgment lingered at every thin slice of cake, at every friendly compliment that felt like a challenge. Then the phone call came. My mother sent that photo of Ryan and a text that said he was 95 pounds and that he was doing everything I had done. When I saw his hollow face, I thought of my own reflection from years ago and felt a sick, electric rush that mixed guilt and recognition and a fierce protective panic. I called my therapist at 2 in the morning and she talked me down. She said, "You can help without losing the life you fought so hard to make." I clung to that. My friend Maya showed up with a thermos of tea and no questions asked. We made lists: treatment centers, stabilization units, clinicians who understood refeeding syndrome. I made a spreadsheet like some kind of practical prayer. My therapist gave me scripts. "I can help with logistics, but I will not discuss bodies or weights," and we practiced them until they felt wearable. Booking the flight felt like jumping off a cliff, but staying home felt like locking my brother in a repeating nightmare. I bought a ticket, packed a single carry-on with sensible things, protein bars, a change of clothes, my own toothbrush, and left my scale at home like a test for myself. On the plane, I forced down a bag of pretzels, counting breaths to keep the old voice from pinching my stomach into knots. Landing in my hometown was worse. Everything had that low-resolution look of memory. The house smelled the same, clean, controlled, a perfume of disappointment, and Mom opened the door with Ryan behind her, hollow and smaller than the picture suggested. She greeted me with that same clipped tone that always sounded like an accusation, and immediately turned everything back into an argument, as if crisis was a stage for her to perform on. I grabbed Ryan, took him outside, and we walked until he sat down on a lawn and the color left his face. He tried to stand and collapsed. I called 911 with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and told them the truth: years of strict portions, morning weigh-ins, punishment disguised as care, and they believed me. The paramedics were efficient and quiet, the kind of professionals who had seen this before and wore patients like armor. In the ER, they kept him for monitoring. Dr. Marcus Hale explained refeeding risks in plain language I could understand. Nurses read my notes, my list of dates, the bite-sized birthday cake, the locked fridge, and their faces didn't judge so much as catalog the pattern. When the dust settled and Ryan was under medical care, I did something I'd been afraid to do for years. I set boundaries with my mother and stuck to them. No comments about bodies, no comparisons, medical updates through clinicians only. She agreed too quickly, which made my skin crawl, but the hospital had eyes and rules and a social worker named Claire who organized supervised meetings and took my history down like evidence. I coordinated with insurance, booked a residential treatment slot, and put the plan in motion. I flew back the same day Ryan was transferred and crashed into the arms of recovery work, my own and his, leaning on Maya and my therapist to keep me steady. The rest is work we're doing now: therapy, monitored meals, honest conversations that hurt and heal in small, hard ways. We haven't fixed everything, but for the first time in a long time we have a plan that feels honest, and that counts for something. 2 years away didn't erase the damage. My hands still trembled when I thought about scales, and eating in front of people felt impossible, like I was performing a crime. I am a man, only man telling this, and the urge to weigh myself was a constant itch I couldn't scratch without panicking afterward. I could sit across from someone at dinner and barely touch my food because a quiet voice in my head kept running numbers. Compliments sounded like traps. Every friendly "you look great" was a ledger I didn't trust. I had built routines to survive: therapy twice a week, safe foods on my shelf, trusted friends who knew when to stand guard, and it felt like progress, but the old patterns waited like landmines. Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's jump back into the story. Then my mother called crying that our father had left and something had happened with Ryan. She sent a photo that hit me like a blow: skin so thin his cheek hollows looked carved out, eyes like dark coins, clothes hanging on him. I stared at that picture until my phone burned my palm. My therapist's voice came back to me from memory. Going back could undo everything you've built. I paced the kitchen, heart jackhammering, and remembered nights I'd spent learning to separate her voice from mine. I thought of the note I left that said, "I choose myself," and the life I'd made in another state. The idea of stepping back into that house felt like stepping into quicksand. At 2:00 a.m. I called the therapist's emergency line and she answered like an anchor. "Breathe with me," she said, and I followed, pushing air slow into my ribs until the racing eased enough for thought. She asked questions in a calm, steady way: how long can you be there? What boundaries do you need to keep? Who can support you on the ground? We built a boundary list right there in the dark. No body comments, no comparisons, all medical conversations only with clinicians present, and absolutely no surprise visits. She reminded me how easy it is for the old control patterns to slip into a crisis like grease on a pan. "You can help," she said, "but not by going back to everything that hurt you." My mother agreed to the rules over text too fast, which made my skin crawl. Her quick okay felt like a red flag. She only ever agreed that fast when she needed something or when she was about to turn a crisis into theater. Still, what kind of person refuses to help their child at that point? I felt pulled between suspicion and the raw need to help Ryan. I called my friend Maya, and she arrived at my apartment before sunrise with a thermos of tea and nothing but steady hands. We sat at my tiny kitchen table and started making lists like surgeons prepping a room: local medical stabilization units, residential programs that treated eating disorders, outpatient clinics with experience in refeeding syndrome, emergency rooms that had handled severe malnutrition cases. We made a spreadsheet and turned something messy and terrifying into data: names, phone numbers, bed availability, insurance contacts. Maya sat beside me and read items off the list while I typed, and she said things that cut through my fog with practical calm: call the hospital first, ask about EKGs and electrolyte monitoring, get a social worker on the line. We filled columns with clinicians' names and a column that said family policies, because I needed to know whether visits would be scheduled or weaponized. We listed what supplies to bring for a discreet hotel stay: protein bars, a small kettle, apartment-safe meals to keep me steady without triggering the old counting rituals. The therapist helped me draft scripts to use with Mom in case she tried to take control. I practiced out loud: "I will not discuss bodies or weights. All updates come through clinicians." I practiced leaving sentences unfinished and walking away. Maya role-played the part of my mother so I could rehearse saying no without apologizing. It felt like training for an emotional raid. We also made contingency plans for how to act if the hospital judged Ryan's condition less urgent than it looked in the photo. Who to call next? Which social workers to escalate to? What documentation to bring that proved long-term abuse rather than a sudden decline? I booked the earliest flight I could afford and chose a hotel a short drive from the hospital, something with a kitchenette so I could manage my meals without using the facility as a stage for old anxieties. I left my scale at home as a test for myself. It felt symbolic in a way that made my chest clench, but I needed to prove I could resist that reflex. I packed light, took my therapist's number, and left a note for my landlord saying I'd be back in a few days. The whole night before the flight, I lay awake rehearsing the boundary phrases and the emergency scripts. Maya slept on my couch and woke me with coffee and a steadying hug. I promised her I'd call the moment I had any concrete news. On the plane, I forced down a small packet of crackers and counted the breaths the therapist had taught me, trying not to imagine Mom's voice measuring the crumbs. The town I was flying into looked smaller than on the map and somehow more dangerous because the problem was now walking, breathing, human, and close. I felt like an old thing being put back together but fragile, and the work ahead felt like marching toward a place that might hold both rescue and relapse. I kept repeating the plan in my head. Stabilize Ryan, insist on clinician-led decisions, enforce boundaries with Mom, and protect my own recovery at any cost. That promise to myself was the only compass I had as the plane touched down and the next step of the messy, necessary rescue began. The flight back felt like walking into memory, like every small-town storefront was a page from my childhood diary with the ink faded and sticky. I am a man, only man telling this, and the ballet studio where my mother dragged me to watch Chloe had been a clean place of judgment. Now it was a phone repair shop with a neon sign flickering. The house looked worse than I remembered. Dead garden, peeling shutters, the kind of neglect that smells like shame. When my mother opened the door, she wore the same tight smile that always read like an accusation. Behind her, my brother, Ryan, stood in the shadow of the hallway, smaller than even the picture she'd sent. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He stayed as if his body was a room he didn't want to enter. She greeted me with one of those backhanded compliments that landed like a shove. "You look well," she said, and the tone made it an accusation instead of a kindness. Before I could answer, she started listing grievances, how I'd abandoned the family, how my leaving had made everything worse, and immediately folded Ryan into the script like a prop. I grabbed Ryan's arm and told him, "Come on, let's get you outside for some air." He tried to stand, took a step, and his knees buckled. He sat down on a neighbor's lawn and then he collapsed hard onto the grass, lips already tinged an insane blue and his breathing thin as if someone had taken the air out of the room. My hands went numb and hot at the same time. I called 911 with my voice shaking and the dispatcher asking me simple, sharp questions like anchors. "Is he conscious? Is he breathing?" I said, "He's here with me. He's hardly breathing. Please hurry." My mother started screaming about embarrassment and neighbors watching like his body was a piece of furniture she could hide under a sheet. That anger cut through me like ice because in that moment I couldn't tell if she was more afraid of being seen or of losing control. The paramedics came fast and professional, with equipment and a calm I needed like a flashlight in a storm. One of them said, "Vitals are bad, we need to get him to the ER now." They said his heart rate and blood pressure were dangerously low and that he needed immediate hospital care. At the ER, the staff moved with quiet speed. I kept repeating the same stupid things to myself: "Don't faint, don't fall apart," while nurses took vitals and attached leads. I told a nurse everything I could think of about years of portion control, morning weigh-ins, locked fridges, and the public humiliations that had been normal at our house. I said it all in a rush because I wanted someone to hear the pattern, not a sudden relapse but a long program of control. The nurse listened with a face I trusted. She wrote notes like a jury listening to testimony. "This isn't just a phase," I said, and the words landed heavy in the fluorescent light. She nodded and connected me to a social worker who asked for dates, examples, and people to contact. Then Dr. Marcus Hale, the doctor in charge, came out with steady eyes and a plain voice that cut through the panic. He explained refeeding risks in simple terms. Start slowly, watch electrolytes, monitor the heart for arrhythmias, no sudden increases in calories because the body can shut down under the stress. He said they'd need to keep Ryan for days, maybe longer, to stabilize him medically before any serious psychiatric work could begin. "We'll give him IV fluids and check his EKG," he said bluntly. "We won't rush." His calm made me feel less crazy and more like my panic had landed in the right place. I filled out forms with shaking hands, listing events I hadn't talked about fully in years. The tiny forkfuls of cake, the weigh-ins, the punishments, the comparisons that turned my brother and me into projects. I wrote it all down because I wanted to make sure the team understood this was abuse that had been normalized, not a teen phase. The social worker took my phone numbers, my therapist's contact, and asked whether my mother had any history of controlling behavior. I said yes and let out the truth like a confession. It felt like the right word to use because calling it abuse finally made room for action. While they ran labs and monitored his heart rate, I sat in the plastic chairs by the nurse's station and watched monitors blink like small warnings. My mother hovered in and out of the room, performing despair whenever a nurse looked her way, and I stayed between them when I could, small and solid like a wall. I told the staff about the locked fridge, the mornings of scales, the comments that made food feel like a sin, and how the patterns had taught Ryan to hate himself. They wrote everything down and promised a medical plan. That promise felt like a rope thrown to both of us, thin, but solid enough to hold when everything else seemed ready to snap. I am a man, only man telling this, and Claire, the social worker, moved fast like someone who had seen the book before and knew how the chapters went. She set up supervised family meetings and started the mountain of paperwork you need for residential programs, asking for records, dates, and names like she was building a case file to fight with. She used plain language with my mother, so there was no wiggle room, everything would be documented, every meeting noted, and no private confrontations would be allowed. That felt like a small victory, like putting locks on the doors to keep history from repeating itself. My father finally sent insurance numbers over text and then didn't come to the hospital. He sent, "I can't face it," and that was that. His absence punched a hole in the middle of me because he'd always been softer in public, tougher in private, and now he hid. I sat in the sterile room with my brother Ryan beside me, watching the lines on the monitor like they were Morse code. I tried to make something normal out of the moment. "Hey, remember that stupid level you couldn't beat?" I said, stupidly casual. He managed a tiny laugh and asked for his handheld. "I'll go get it," I promised, meaning it like a promise to the last normal thing left in him. The team ran labs. The numbers were sharp and ugly. Electrolytes dangerously low, heart rate slower than a healthy beat should be, blood pressure that made the nurse frown and write extra notes. A nurse had to wrap the pediatric cuff twice around his thin arm to get a reading that wasn't a ghost. She looked at me and said, "We have to be careful. Refeeding is a risk and his heart's sensitive." Dr. Marcus Hale explained it again in plain words. "Start slow, monitor electrolytes, watch the EKG," and the staff moved like a machine built for this exact emergency. My mother moved like she was under a script written to defend herself. One minute she said, "It's just a stomach bug," and the next she aimed blame at me for leaving because in her logic, leaving equals harm. She said, "If you stayed, this wouldn't have happened," and each time she opened her mouth it felt like she tried to fold him back into old patterns. Claire kept the family meetings supervised and documented. Claire would not let my mother redirect the story. "We will only discuss medical facts in this setting," Claire said calmly. "Personal grievances are not part of clinical care." That line saved me from answering questions I didn't have to answer. I crashed in a cheap hotel a few blocks from the hospital and forced myself to follow the meal plan my therapist had given me. I ate a granola bar and pretzels, counted nothing, and breathed through the alarms that always tried to tell me I was cheating if I ate too much. It was a small act of defiance against the old rules. Maya texted constant check-ins, "Did you eat?" and "Call me when you can." Those texts were lifelines. My therapist called twice to remind me of scripts and to coach me through moments when my own history threatened to pull me back into restriction. Hospital days blurred into lists and phone calls, calling insurance to fast-track authorizations, faxing the forms Claire requested, and emailing intake coordinators at residential programs with his labs attached. I made a spreadsheet like I had before: contacts, dates, expected approvals, and I checked boxes that felt like tiny wins. Ryan had lucid moments where he asked for snacks and complained about the hospital pudding. He said, "They keep feeding me this stuff," and I said, "Tell them what you want and we'll try to get it." Those small bits of normalcy mattered. They were proof he was still in there. Claire arranged the first supervised family meeting and sat between us like a referee who actually cared. She asked the clinicians to explain the timeline, and they said medical stabilization first, then intensive therapy. We agreed on rules: no wait talk, no past punishments, and only clinician-led updates. When my mother tried to steer the conversation into blame, Claire cut her off with notes and a firm, "We're here for Ryan's health." It felt like muscles getting stronger in a body that had been beaten up for years. I didn't know if it would hold, but for the first time since I left, I felt like there was a team who saw the pattern and was working to stop it. I am a man, only man telling this, and insurance felt like a war where the bullets were forms and the trenches were hold music. I spent hours on hold, my phone burning my ear, while Claire hammered details into the admission line at a residential program that had one slot if Ryan could get medical clearance. "He needs stable vitals for 48 hours, the admissions nurse said, voice like a gatekeeper. "He must be taking nutrition by mouth without vomiting, and there must be no acute cardiac issues on transfer." Those sounded like common-sense rules, but in the context of starvation, they were more like gates that could slam shut any minute. I signed paper after paper in the hospital room, naming myself as emergency contact and filling out family history forms until my hand cramped. The social worker watched me as I wrote the same things I'd said out loud for years. The morning weigh-ins, the locked fridge, the tiny bites of cake on birthdays. I cried while explaining portion control and public weigh-ins because these weren't just facts on a form. They were a timeline of how someone learned to hate eating. A nurse handed me tissues and said, "You did the right thing bringing him in," like a small punctuation in a paragraph that had been silenced for too long. My voice when I spoke to clinicians was flat, rehearsed, because rawness felt dangerous in a place that needed facts to act. My mother found a way to corner me in a hallway and she turned it into a negotiation. "You'll have to come home," she told me, voice small but sharp. "We need you. Ryan needs family." It was guilt dressed up as responsibility. I said, "I will coordinate with the team, but I won't live there. I can help arrange treatment and visits under rules, but I won't move back into a house that taught us to hurt each other." Her face changed from hurt to something calculative, and she tried one last time to pull me into the old orbit. I held my ground because I'd learned the cost of returning was my own survival. Claire and Dr. Marcus Hale took the next steps like they knew the map through this territory. They wrote letters documenting medical necessity for residential admission, detailing labs, EKG changes, and the long history of restrictions so insurance would see this as urgent care, not elective therapy. I watched them type and call and push back on bureaucratic no's, and that muscle of advocacy felt like an outsider art I was suddenly part of. Dr. Hale called the insurance medical reviewer directly and explained the real risks: refeeding syndrome, electrolyte imbalance, and cardiac instability. He used terms that made the insurance rep sit up and listen, and for the first time the paperwork stopped feeling like a sieve and started to look like a door that might open. We also had to meet the criteria the hospital set down: 24 to 48 hours of stable vitals, an ability for Ryan to take nutrition orally without vomiting, and clean EKG readings. The medical team ran repeat labs and watched his telemetry like hawks. Nurses came in every few hours to check on him and to adjust the slow feeds that would try to coax his body back from the brink. Some moments were almost painfully ordinary: Ryan drifting in and out of sleep, asking for music, or complaining about the hospital tray. But beneath that ordinary was an emergency that needed patient, clinical care. I split my time between the hospital and a cheap hotel, sleeping badly and eating a granola bar when I could. I made calls to the residential program, faxed the new lab results, and waited for the official yes. Claire scheduled supervised family meetings and documented every conversation with my mother, which kept her from doing the usual gaslight moves. She would say something manipulative, and Claire would write it down and redirect the meeting back to medical facts. That kind of structure saved me from feeling like I had to argue with my past while trying to fight for my brother's future. My father texted insurance numbers and a weak apology, and then he didn't come to the hospital. That absence felt like a comment on his complicity. He could send numbers but not his presence. I was angry, but anger had to be rationed. Ryan needed energy to stabilize, not a platform for our family drama. So I used that energy to press the forms, to push for the medically necessary language that would get Ryan the bed he needed. When the insurance rep finally agreed pending stability metrics, it felt like a small, exhausted victory. The team promised to keep me updated, to set up phone appointments, and to include me in decisions from a distance so I could help without being pulled back into the toxic orbit of my childhood home. The slow work of stabilization began. Machines beeped, nurses checked lines, and clinicians placed hold on the chaotic parts of our history so we could do the one thing that mattered right then: keep Ryan's heart beating while we readied a place that could teach him to eat without shame. It wasn't a miracle, it was paperwork and patience and people doing the jobs they were trained for. For the first time in a long time, I felt a professional team standing between us and the old patterns. And that created a dangerous, fragile hope I hadn't allowed myself in years. He drank a portion of a nutrition shake and the whole room exhaled like someone had opened a window. I'm a man, only man telling this, and I sat by the bedside watching the nurse hold the cup steady while Ryan tipped it and swallowed. He didn't throw up. The nurses traded those small, relieved looks that say more than words. Dr. Marcus Hale came in afterward and said in a quiet voice, "This is good, but recovery will take months, not weeks." Hearing that made my chest both ache and unclench at the same time. Claire called the next morning with news that sounded almost too good to breathe. A residential spot had opened if Ryan could keep his vitals stable for 5 more days. I remember saying, "We'll do it," like I could will the world into making a place safe. Then I spent the day doing the things that actually make that happen: organizing flight bookings, working out visitation windows, scheduling video therapy sessions, and lining up emergency contact backups in case someone needed to call me at 2 a.m. I made lists and spreadsheets like armor. Each item felt heavy with meaning. A plane ticket held the promise of distance from the old house. A visitation plan promised supervised safety, and a scheduled video session promised continuity of care. Every checkbox I ticked felt like a small rescue. The nurses kept watching his telemetry, drew labs every morning, and adjusted his slow feeds to avoid refeeding syndrome. Each chemical result was a small weather report for his body, sodium, potassium, phosphate, and some mornings the numbers made my hands shake reading them. Claire coordinated intake forms with the residential program and faxed everything Dr. Hale's team needed. When one document got lost in the bureaucracy, Claire called and argued like a lawyer who actually cared about human lives instead of rules. "They need to see the labs," she said. "This is not optional." Her insistence kept doors open that could have closed otherwise. At night, I still worried like a creature trained by old rules. I fretted over numbers in my head, calorie counts, weights, times between meals, even though I knew intellectually that my life had to move forward without those rituals. Maya sat with me during meals like a guard on watch. She didn't say much, but her presence was a kind of permission to eat. "Just one more bite," she would say softly when my hands hovered, and then we'd both eat slowly like people relearning a habit. Those quiet, steady evenings were a lifeline more than any grand speech could be. There were small, human moments that kept me tethered. Ryan complained about the hospital pudding and asked for music on his phone, and when I fetched his handheld, he gripped it like a signal that part of him was still whole. He talked about a level in a game he wanted to beat and even joked, "Get me some real food and I'll carry you through the boss." That laugh, thin as it was, felt like a promise. He had lucid hours when he could be a brother again, and I clung to those hours because they showed me who he was under the damage. My mother attended a family education session at the hospital and for once sat quietly and listened without ridiculing the clinicians or us. She asked a few questions that sounded like she was trying to understand rather than perform. Later, she joined an online parents support group and actually began attending meetings. Hearing that made me cautiously optimistic and also wary. Habits like hers are hard to break and easy to relapse into. I kept my boundaries firm with her, text updates only, no surprise visits, and all discussions about treatment to be clinician-led. And I practiced saying those boundaries out loud until they didn't feel jagged. Dr. Hale warned again that this was a long road. "We're asking his body to trust food again," he said, "and that takes time and steady hands." That steady hand became our plan: stabilize medically, then send him to a place where staff could teach him safe meals and therapy without the old scripts of shame. The clinic's intake nurse confirmed the 5-day window contingent on stable vitals, and I realized each day had turned into a test we had to pass to get him the right help. On the morning before his potential transfer, I packed a small bag for him with soft clothes, a charger, and a list of songs to play during hard hours. I wrote down the visitation schedule and left copies at the nurse's station. I called my therapist and she reminded me to check in with my own meal plan and sleep schedule, not just his. I kept showing up to do the practical things: booking, signing, calling, because action felt like meaning when emotion ran too hot. When the call finally came that everything looked stable enough to move forward, I cried in the hospital hallway like the fight had finally gotten a break. It wasn't victory. It wasn't even close. But it was progress, and the team's quiet competence had turned my frantic lists into real steps. For the first time in a long time, hope felt like something practical I could carry in my hands, one plane ticket and one carefully written referral at a time. I helped him pack into a clear plastic bin like we were moving out of a war zone, quick and quiet and painfully careful about what he was allowed to bring. I am a man, only man telling this, and watching Ryan fold the one hoodie he could keep felt like watching someone fold a life back into a box. He could barely stand straight, but he managed the walk to the transport van in small steps, each one a raw promise. I hugged him stiff and awkward because my arms felt like they might break from the weight of everything, and I said, "I'll visit every week for the first month. I won't let you do this alone." He blinked, and the hint of a smile ghosted across his face like a signal light. The staff checked his paperwork and double-checked the meds and the list of allowed items. A nurse said, "We'll keep him comfortable and call you if anything changes," and I believed her because the team had already kept more promises than my family had. Ryan climbed into the van and turned back once to wave with his small, trembling hand. I waved until the vehicle rounded the corner. My flight back left a few hours later, and the trip home felt like permission to breathe for the first time in weeks. The town below looked like a memory you could edit, smaller and softer at the edges, and the tightness that had lived in my chest uncoiled enough for me to actually feel air. The next day, my therapist cleared time for a long session. She sat with me and we rebuilt my meal plan like repairing a machine you loved. We talked through the triggers the hospital stay had thrown at me, nurses' routines that echoed childhood rules, the sight of scales, the numbers flashing on monitors, and she helped me build coping strategies to keep my recovery intact while supporting Ryan. She said, "You can be his advocate without reliving what hurt you." We practiced phrases for when my mother tried to pull me back into the old system. "I will coordinate care, but I will not return to living there." Saying it out loud made it less like a wish and more like a policy. I set up a communication routine with Claire that felt like a backbone. Weekly updates by text, scheduled video family therapy sessions, and contingency plans if anything went sideways. Claire promised to call me if labs dipped or if telemetry showed odd rhythms. I promised to answer or to have Maya answer for me if I couldn't. We built a chain of people who could act without letting emotion bend the facts. I also booked flights for visits, planned which weekends I could be there, and asked the residential facility about their visiting hours and family involvement policies. They sent me a packet of rules and a welcome sheet and a phone number I saved like a lifeline. At night my sleep still came in fits, but Maya sat with me for meals and held space when words failed. She would say little things like, "Eat your sandwich, you earned that." Her voice was a steady hand that kept my hands from returning to old habits. I also keyed in times for my own therapy check-ins and wrote them into my phone calendar as if they were appointments I could not miss. I needed structure like a scaffold until the new normal could hold on its own. A week after he arrived, I got a text from an unknown number that turned out to be Ryan calling from the program's phone. The message said, "Therapy dogs twice a week, I like them." It was not dramatic, it was not a medical note. It was a small human thing that meant the facility allowed him ordinary comforts. I fell to my knees in my kitchen and sobbed, the kind of ugly cry that comes from the end of a long, terrible ration of fear and relief mingled together. I called Claire right away and she laughed softly and said, "That's progress, keep holding on to that." Hearing her call it progress changed the word in my mouth from hope to plan. My mother started attending online parent meetings at Claire's suggestion, and I watched her reports with wary optimism. She wrote short messages about listening and learning, and while I wanted to believe it, I kept my guard up. I told Claire I'd keep updates in writing and that all decisions would go through the clinicians. Claire agreed and promised to maintain the records. That level of documentation felt like armor. It also kept me honest with myself. I had to protect my own recovery while I advocated for my brother. The weeks that followed were small, steady things. Video sessions with Ryan where he showed me a new game victory, emails with lab results showing slow improvements, and phone calls with therapists discussing meal plans. Each small step was a stitch in a larger repair job. Nothing about this felt clean or fast, but it felt real. I kept showing up, booking flights, answering Claire's updates, and eating when Maya sat with me. It wasn't a victory lap. It was folding a life back into a shape that could hold room for both of us to get better, one careful, hard day at a time. None of this felt neat. I am a man, only man telling this, and the truth is messy. My mother had finally started asking for help. Ryan was in inpatient care and making tiny moves toward eating without panic, and I was back in therapy learning how to hold my ground while I helped from a distance. I still had urges that hit like old habits, counting bites in my head, wanting to step on a scale after every meal, and some nights I ate less than I should because my mouth forgot the rules my mind had learned. Those slips didn't mean I'd failed. They meant recovery was work that didn't end when a plane left the ground. I kept saying out loud what my therapist told me: "You can be present without becoming the crisis." Saying it felt like a rope I could grab when the old voice got loud. I set boundaries and practiced them until they stopped sounding like wishes and started sounding like policies. When my mother texted with a frantic tone, I replied with a script: "I will coordinate care by clinicians. No wait talk, no surprise visits." She answered with short promises that sounded rehearsed, and I stayed cautious because I know how quickly old roles can come back when fear presses on them. Ryan's improvement was slow and small and stubborn in the best possible way. He learned to like a bite of toast again, then a half sandwich, then a proper meal in a day room with a nurse watching. He grew hair back in places that looked bare before, and his voice stopped sounding so thin on calls. He once texted, "Beat the boss on level 9, and that tiny victory felt like proof that the person I loved could survive the parts that nearly killed him. When he laughed, actual messy brother laughter, I felt it in my chest like a light that had been turned on. Treatment wasn't a straight line. There were bad labs some days and long calls with clinicians explaining setbacks that felt like ground slipping. Claire kept sending weekly updates and scheduling the video family therapy sessions that forced us to talk about things we used to dodge. Those calls were awkward at first. My mother would circle back to blame, and I would have to stop her gently with, "This meeting is for Ryan's treatment, not past fights." Sometimes she listened. Sometimes she needed the group sessions to catch up. Progress, I learned, is often a series of small correct choices rather than one big fix. I still weighed myself more than I should. Some mornings the old counting crept up like a habit I couldn't shake, and I'd have to call Maya or my therapist before I gave in. They helped me name the feeling instead of folding into it. "That's the old voice," Maya would say, and then we'd eat together in silence until it passed. Those shared meals taught me how ordinary eating could be the opposite of performance. It was just food, it was fuel, it was not a scoreboard. We did not erase history. The record of mornings on scales, the nights of locked fridges, and the voice that loved to compare still lived in my memory and in Ryan's. Sometimes he would flinch when someone talked about dessert on TV, and I would put my hand on his shoulder and breathe with him. Sometimes my mother would say something small and cruel without thinking and then sit in shame after, a shape of regret trying to learn a different kind of love. That didn't make her clean of the past, but it made her a person who had started to work on the parts that hurt others. What I did was ugly and careful and not complete. I called therapists and social workers and tapped out texts to Claire at odd hours. I argued with insurance reps and filled forms until my hand cramped. I booked flights and planned visits while simultaneously making sure I ate when Maya sat across from me. I kept a list of emergency contacts and scripts in my phone because crisis had taught me that plans mattered more than speeches. I learned to say no to being pulled back into the house where praise always came with a cost. That imperfect triumph none of us fixed, but each of us trying felt like a reason to keep going. Ryan was alive and in a program that taught him food could be less terrifying. My mother had at least started learning new language in a support group. I had not lost myself in the rescue. We were all in small ways in recovery. Some days that felt like enough to stand up and make coffee, to eat a full breakfast, to answer Claire's weekly update with a steady heart. I am not closing this chapter like it's complete. I know the work continues and that relapse is a possible future if we drop our guard. But for now I carry something I didn't have for a long time, a fragile practical hope built from meetings, phone calls, and the sound of a brother laughing on the other end of a line. We didn't fix the past. We made a plan to survive the future together. That, for now, is what keeps me going. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.